Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schwartz to the podium.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Will, for your very kind introduction. I am beyond thrilled to be here today at the Design of Medical Devices Conference at the University of Minnesota, speaking on behalf of FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health. The very breadth and depth of this conference's programming matches up really with what I aspire to do in leading our center at CDRH's Science and Strategic Partnerships initiatives. And having spent many years in academia as a physician scientist, as a burn surgeon, as you heard, involved in clinical and translational research, as well as at a medical device startup as its medical director, seeing the synergy that's presented here in different models is very energizing for me, and it reaffirms the value, as well as actually more than the value, it reaffirms the necessity for convergence among academia, industry, and government partners. And I'll take it one step further. It's not often that a conference comes around where I have the opportunity to engage directly with an audience that represents all or nearly all of these stakeholders within the ecosystem of medical devices. And so it's really gratifying to be able to interact with individuals who are so deeply committed all along the spectrum of medical device innovation from its very earliest design phases, from concept, design, through the R&D, research and development, to manufacturing, as well as being inclusive of healthcare providers, professional societies, end users, and of course, especially patients. So where does this all relate to? How does this relate to this afternoon's talk about medical device cybersecurity? Well, what I'd like to propose to you is that as we drill down to its core, and as we strip away really all of the bells and whistles, forward momentum and progress in medical device security really relies heavily upon collaboration across multiple stakeholder groups. It's not an oversimplification to state that safeguarding our patients takes harnessing the collective will and creating a culture of multi-stakeholder engagement. Now, for the healthy skeptics in the room today, this might sound like let's all sit around a campfire and sing Kumbaya, but I can share with you that by no means is this type of collaboration an easy task. Where we at FDA are today with regard to medical device security is a culmination of efforts that are deeply rooted, deeply anchored in outreach, engagement, and collaboration. Several years ago, we set on this path, which has been an arduous journey, learning early on that it's critical for us at FDA to be able to understand the very differing perspectives, to hear out the concerns that are voiced by our stakeholders. And parenthetically, I would say that some of these voices are totally new to us at FDA in terms of folks that we have not previously engaged with. And indeed, to allow ourselves to look through the lens of the many parties who constitute this universe of medical devices. And it's only through grappling with the challenges that we're able to propose the kind of policy and regulatory frameworks that are not only feasible, they have to be implementable, of course, but that they also embed within them appropriate incentives for strengthening the security of medical devices. So what is the issue that we're facing today? Well, at the 100,000-foot view, healthcare and public health, which is a sector of critical infrastructure, represents a significant and a very large attack surface today for our nation. And as a sector, it's considered to be a soft target By now, we've all seen a flurry of attacks on hospitals and healthcare systems that have been highlighted in the media. And both vendors and hospitals alike tell us that they're constantly fending off attempts at intrusions and breaches into their systems. These types of intrusions occur through weaknesses in system architecture. As we recognize today, and as was heard even in the session prior to this, in the cybersecurity session, these can be of varying motivations. So when we put this into a frame of reference, security vulnerabilities can directly impact medical devices. They can directly impact hospital network operations. And when medical device vulnerabilities are not addressed and remediated, they can serve as those access points, those points of entry into the larger hospital and healthcare network, which can lead to compromise of data confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, acceptance of this reality has not come easy, and it requires an attitudinal and a culture shift for many. And as challenging as it is to effect this kind of a change in mindset and behavior, we all do have to come to terms with this being the new normal. So what is FDA's role within this space? First and foremost, it is about upholding our mission, which is to protect and promote the public health. And at CDRH, what does that mean? That means we want to provide patients with a reasonable assurance that the devices that they are using or that's being used on them and that we regulate are safe and effective. We're raising cybersecurity awareness at FDA by also leveraging knowledge and translating that knowledge that's coming in from other industry sectors into healthcare and public health. By promoting safety and security by design through clear regulatory expectations, and we did this with our pre-market guidance that I'll speak to. Promoting coordinated vulnerability disclosure and proactive vulnerability management as we have articulated in our post-market draft guidance. And finally, but probably most importantly, how do we move from being in this reactive stance to one that is much more forward-leaning and proactive? Because that's really at the key. Well, how do we do that? We have to be able to foster this whole of community approach. And that's really at the essence. So fostering a whole of community approach, one might ask, why is that so difficult? Why is that so hard to accomplish? This shouldn't be so difficult. And yet in characterizing the medical device security within the broader healthcare public health ecosystem, it's these kinds of descriptors that come to mind. We're talking about an immature state that's rapidly evolving. It's highly volatile. You never know what's going to happen, what's going to be announced, what's going to occur the next day. It's tense. There are competing needs, and very, very diverse as well in terms of its stakeholders. Over the past 18 months, MITRE, and MITRE is a federally funded research center, has supported CDRH's strategic efforts in medical device security by first taking a deep dive and studying all of the stakeholders involved here through focused interviews and then identifying gaps and challenges. So I'll spend a few slides now walking you through the stakeholder study. And we're going to start with the healthcare delivery organizations. So from a healthcare delivery organization perspective, this quote kind of comes right out at you. If you've seen one hospital, you've seen one hospital. The diversity that exists across facilities within the United States. Hospitals, facilities will note that they absolutely feel that they are on the front lines to ensure patient safety, and ultimately they feel total responsibility for that. But it is for that very reason that medical device security, while important, is only one of many other challenging issues that the healthcare facility has to face up to. And it's often for that reason that the perception is that boards, C-suites, and doctors do not consider security as high a priority as it should be. Hospitals will tell us that it's difficult to convince medical device manufacturers to fix discovered issues that are in products that are deployed, that are distributed in the field. And then this concept of vulnerabilities that have been identified in the wild, vulnerabilities that have been identified that have not gone through a coordinated type of disclosure process can be highly disruptive to the clinical operations within the hospital facility. Let's take a look at what the medical device manufacturer's perspective has been. Yep. Hang on. There we go. Okay. Manufacturers are driven by speed to market. The regulatory focus, as it should be, has been on safety through FDA, on privacy, regulated through Office of Civil Rights. Manufacturers will admit to the fact that because of the various diversity across hospital environments, it's often very difficult to understand what any one particular hospital's needs actually are. Security requirements are not provided in a consistent and in a reproducible way. Manufacturers, in interacting with cybersecurity researchers, often called ethical hackers or white hats, has been, in the past, a very difficult and tense relationship, at times an adversarial relationship, one which, parenthetically, FDA has been really working towards moving into a much more collegial relationship, and one where both parties are going to benefit. And then the size of the manufacturing organization plays a significant role. We recognize, and this came out through the stakeholder study, that smaller firms possess the agility, the ability to move much more quickly, and yet at the same time they're faced with less resources in order to be able to deal with security in-house. On the other hand, larger manufacturers perhaps have the resources within, and they may have adopted better practices, but being able to move in as timely and an expedient a manner is often a challenge. So what is the perspective of the cybersecurity researcher, again, the ethical or the white hat hacker? First of all, these might include individuals who are working independently. They may be working as consultants for a security research firm. They may be working as consultants for a manufacturer or a healthcare organization. And they may be patients as well. Their motivations can vary. Their expertise and experience level will vary. From the researcher's perspective, the researcher will often voice that most manufacturers are to date not prepared or are ill-prepared to be able to be in a receiving mode for vulnerabilities as they have been identified. Researchers will also admit to the fact that for many of them, understanding the clinical environment is somewhat new and is an area of needed growth. Similarly, how to operate within a regulatory environment is something that's entirely new to the security researcher. But one of the larger concerns that researchers have voiced is the fact that they very much want to be able to continue to provide value and to do this research, and yet it is quite cost prohibitive to be able to obtain the medical devices in order to do that type of research, and difficult to gain access to it. So all of the preceding slides really focus on unique perspectives of different stakeholder groups. There were also common themes that emerged, and happily we can say that patient safety is agreed upon as the highest priority. The not such good news is that there is a lack of trust across stakeholders. And we've known this now for a couple of years. It's an area that we're seeing definitely some progress and some improvement, but clearly an area that requires further work. So what are some examples of that? The NDAs and non-disclosure agreements that exist between stakeholders reduces or impedes the ability to share information in a timely manner across the community within healthcare. Healthcare delivery organizations aren't able to share their internal evaluations with their peers, with other HDOs, and researchers are unable to share information that's learned when it's under a contract with a medical device manufacturer, an HDO. And so that information is kept in a somewhat isolated manner, and without the information sharing, that really impacts on the ability to be as responsive and as timely as we would like to be. There's limited visibility into how the impact of the vulnerability affects prioritization. And then the last bullet, which is a rather concerning one, is that there is this belief out there that it's going to take harm. It's going to take seeing patient harm to occur in order to really move the culture within healthcare and public health to react and to do something differently here. And of course, that is an area that we at the FDA are absolutely looking to dispel in its entirety. So what were the identified gap areas through this stakeholder study? Need for greater alignment of goals between stakeholders. We have to be able to get to a better place of information sharing, whether it's of threats, whether it's of vulnerabilities, and also of best practices learned. Cybersecurity, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There has to be some element of customization depending upon the size of organization, its needs. Importantly also, we have to be able to do that crosswalk of associating, of looking at what the technical aspects of the vulnerability are and what its potential impact is on patient safety. And the reason that's important, again, is because vulnerabilities are ubiquitous and they will continue to abound and to emerge and to evolve over the lifespan of products. And yet not every vulnerability is one that's going to have a safety impact that is of a concern and that warrants immediate action or even some action down the line. And then a lack of a systems engineering view, which is important. So given these gaps, or we can flip it and look on them positively as opportunities, the natural follow-on question is how might we transform the culture of engagement and gain greater alignment of goals with respect to medical device security? What are the impediments that preclude this from happening that we as a collective need to address? Well, so let's start with the very basics. It is about providing a seat at the table, an open gateway for conversation, promoting trust, embodying mutual respect, talking across different stakeholder groups, practicing and upholding that concept of appreciative listening. And I want to share with you this quote that captures this principle that really resonates with me best. Some of the greatest advances happen when people are bold enough to speak their truth and listen to others speak theirs. Well, this was it. I'll point to October 2014 when FDA convened its first public workshop, Collaborative Approaches to Medical Device and Healthcare Security. This was an inflection point, a pivotal moment for us, because it was the first time that we had all of the stakeholder groups represented in the room together, and where they were on panels together as well, and where each had the opportunity to really voice what their pain points are, what their challenges are, what their concerns are, why they're unable to work with another group. And it's only through being able to initiate that kind of a dialogue and to do that in a respectful manner and to really be listening to the other's perspectives that we can move beyond that point. And we have seen some great progress from October 2014 to now, and that was evident even in the 2016 workshop that we held a few months ago. It translates to this concept of being able to develop an understanding of the different stakeholders' constraints and limitations, as well as their expertise. That is why it's about understanding what it is to walk a mile in my shoes, how important that is, to define the rules of engagement so that the community is able to work together towards this collective good of strengthening cybersecurity for the nation's healthcare and public health critical infrastructure and consequently safeguarding our patients. The opportunity for transformative change emerges by all of us really recognizing the different strengths, the tools, the capabilities that we are able to each bring to the table. And by enabling that kind of convergence, we're going to be that much better poised to advance innovation in medical device technologies with the necessary enhancements built in with regard to medical device security. And this is what we at FDA aspire towards when I say fostering a whole of community approach. To get there, though, means that we all, to some sense, have to recalibrate how we face the challenges that we have of today and tomorrow. So what does recalibrating mean for this new reality for manufacturers? It means designing and developing devices that are securable throughout their entire product life cycle. Being mindful, and this is a hard one because it's definitely a change in how we've been thinking about things in the past, but unfortunately there's an active adversary out there. And a device is going to need to be updated on a continuum, really, again, through the lifespan of that product so that it can remain secure and safe, or what we call cyber safe. For that to happen, we have to be able to develop threat modeling for the device and understand the implications of the supply chain as well. And for manufacturers, that means establishing a cybersecurity risk management program. The bullets that appear in purple, those talking points, are talking points that are relevant for all of the stakeholders, and I'll repeat them as we go through them. It is about taking responsibility for making cyber hygiene paramount, responding to and addressing security vulnerabilities that are identified in devices that are on the market, developing disclosure policies. And what does coordinated disclosure look like? And being proactive about vulnerability management. These are all critical components that are necessary for us together to be able to improve the security posture of the ecosystem as a whole. And manufacturers can really be the champions here. They can lead the movement to change the culture of engagement with all stakeholders. For healthcare delivery organizations, what does that recalibration mean? It means understanding a bit better what one is purchasing and deploying, and in fact, perhaps, where it's feasible, including securability for the lifetime of the device into the actual procurement and contract language. Working together from the very beginning with manufacturers and with end users to understand and to make sure to articulate what the needs are for that device. Very importantly, it's internal as well, educating and training end users on the importance of maintaining system security. This comes right into the whole concept of cyber hygiene being paramount within one's organization, for healthcare delivery organizations as well. Being vigilant about monitoring networks and responding to vulnerabilities as they emerge. And finally, healthcare delivery organizations are also important drivers in changing this culture of engagement with all stakeholders. How about for FDA, for the regulator? Well, we have to recalibrate as well, and we have been doing so over the past couple of years. First of all, medical device cybersecurity is highlighted within the top 10 FY 2016 regulatory science priorities at CDRH. We're committed to fostering ongoing efforts to create a trusted environment for vulnerability information sharing. It's on us, it's our responsibility to make sure that we are being very clear in articulating our regulatory expectations for the entire product life cycle. And that's to ensure that the regulatory burdens do not unnecessarily bog down timely fixes to systems. We're going to continue to encourage the community's efforts in developing tools, standards, and other innovative approaches that will strengthen, that will further enhance medical device security. I talked about in-training and awareness for the healthcare delivery organizations. It's just as much true for within the agency. In-training and ongoing education of agency assets is absolutely essential so that we are able to provide more informed review as well as analysis of security vulnerabilities within the pre-market submission process, as well as post-market and analyses of identified vulnerabilities. And we need to be able to do that in a consistent and in a reproducible manner. Cybersecurity concerns necessitate us to shift the paradigm because waiting for adverse events to occur as a result of an exploit is too late. We have to be able to move from being reactive to being proactive. Now, FDA is ultimately concerned with device safety and effectiveness, as that is our authority. But we also recognize that device vulnerabilities can be that vector, they can be that conduit for access to the greater network, even while a device may remain unaffected or unimpacted, and the functionality of the device may be okay. But it can put protected health information, PHI, or PII, personally identifiable information, data at risk. That is why, again, vulnerability disclosure policies, coordinated disclosure, and moving towards proactive management becomes so essential, so integral to improving the security stance of healthcare and public health as a whole. So we see our place in changing the culture of engagement with our stakeholders. There's a critical role for security researchers or hackers here as well, and this should be leveraged. Researchers can have a greater impact by gaining a better understanding and an education of the clinical environment as well as of the regulatory risk-based framework. Of all the stakeholder groups we've talked about, far and away, it's the researchers, the hackers who really understand and recognize the importance of having those kinds of policies in place for vulnerability disclosure, working in a coordinated manner with manufacturers and other entities and with government, as well as being proactive in the management of those vulnerabilities. We need researchers to serve as change agents as well in transforming the culture of engagement with all stakeholders. So as an example of steps that we've taken to transform the culture across the stakeholders in medical device security, I want to share with you a graphic illustration that came out of one of the sessions, the vulnerability management session from our recent 2016 workshop. And what should pop out at you, I mean, it's a little hard to see on the screen here, but there are certain themes and certain words that should resonate. Empathy and shared principles, disclosure, how do we allow for researchers to come forward and provide identification of their vulnerabilities without being in fear of retribution, having a maturity model, the common goal being safer medical devices. These were, again, some of the important talking points and themes that emerged from the session at the recent workshop, and that really characterizes a lot of the progress that has taken place since 2014. Excuse me. Excuse me. So for the remainder of my talk this afternoon, here's what we're going to do. We're going to follow this roadmap. I'm going to frame for you the issues in the context of broader executive initiatives that I've not described. We'll just run through a timeline of FDA's activities. I'll talk a little bit about the key principles of the pre-market cybersecurity guidance that was issued in final in 2014, and then the principles of the draft post-market guidance that we issued in January 2016, and then some of the key takeaways and opportunities for greater impact. So how does our work in medical device security fit within this broader context, in the broader construct, I should say, of what's happening nationally? Back in 2013, the president issued an executive order, and the quote here probably encapsulates everything you need to know. We can achieve these goals through a partnership with owners and operators of critical infrastructure to improve cybersecurity information sharing and collaboratively develop and implement risk-based standards. As we began to face questions and challenges with regard to medical device security, we recognized in 2013 the importance of our being in sync and well aligned with the direction of the executive orders where the country was going from a critical infrastructure perspective. And it was with that we rolled up our sleeves at CDRH, and where there were opportunities for us to participate very actively in various work groups that were established in order to put this kind of a framework together, a framework that NIST was directed to really be the conveners or the facilitators. We participated in those efforts. We wanted to be able to not only have direct input, but direct vision into what was happening that was going to have clear-cut implications for the healthcare public health sector. And so from 2013 onward, we've been spearheading a lot of different efforts in cybersecurity. The slide is a very busy slide, it's very dense, but let me just say that we can often categorize our efforts broadly into really three buckets. Number one, formulating policy, often done through guidance. Number two, communicating safety or risk communications. And third, convening, whether it's convening public meetings as workshops or as advisory committees. And what you'll see as we march through from 2013 to the present is really leveraging, using all three of those mechanisms. We began through coordinating, developing partnerships with Department of Homeland Security's ICS CERT. That partnership, that coordination continues through today with very, very active communication that goes on between our team and the ICS CERT team. We issued safety communications back in 2013 that was a very broad, a very generic one, speaking to all of the stakeholder groups about really developing greater vigilance and awareness, heightening situational awareness around security of medical devices. And we thoroughly engaged in a lot of outreach, education, awareness, building collaboration. Moving into 2014, that's when we finalized the 2013 pre-market guidance on cybersecurity. We convened right after that this first workshop, this workshop that was going to bring together the stakeholders mainly to do a gap analysis and to start that kind of constructive dialogue. We also executed an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, with the National Healthcare Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the NHISAC, expressly for developing a mechanism for information sharing of medical device vulnerabilities in a trusted type of an environment. Into 2015, we continue with this ongoing coordination, and for the first time, FDA issued several product-specific safety communications related to medical device security. We continue to work on building and really distributing out what those partnerships look like and reaching out to further different stakeholder groups. In particular, a lot of focus on developing work with the security researcher community. And in 2016, this year, we number one issued our draft post-market cybersecurity guidance and convened a public workshop to follow in terms of discussing many of the elements that were included within that guidance. From a policy perspective, we want to really underscore the holistic nature, the total product life cycle approach that we've been talking about to medical device security. And so where does it start? It starts with you. It starts with design of medical devices. And so our pre-market guidance really has three core principles. Number one, it emphasizes the shared responsibility between stakeholders. Number two, it's about addressing cybersecurity during the earliest phases of design and development of the medical device. This concept of needing to bake it in, how much more difficult it is to really bolt it on afterwards. And third, somewhat related to number two, is the importance of establishing what those design inputs are for devices related to cybersecurity and establishing a vulnerability and management approach, which is part and parcel of the quality systems regulation. However, because vulnerabilities are going to continue to evolve, and we know that vulnerabilities will continue to emerge, pre-market controls are certainly not going to be adequate. They're not sufficient to manage cybersecurity of devices throughout their entire lifespan. We've therefore proposed policy for managing devices in distribution. So that's the complement to the pre-market guidance, the post-market draft, which is out right now for comment. Comment is closing April 21st. That's less than a week, so just a note for that. So what are the key principles of the draft guidance? Again, can't emphasize enough the collaborative approach for both the information sharing element and the risk assessment piece, for both pieces. We articulate what the responsibilities are for manufacturers by once more leveraging the QSR, the quality systems regulation, as well as what our post-market authorities are. Earlier, I talked about importance of alignment with the presidential executive orders and NIST framework. Well, that's included within our draft guidance. One of the important things that really came out also of the MITRE stakeholder study was being able to define what might be those incentives that we can draw upon as the regulator that could incentivize better behavior, more proactive behavior. And finally, this is a risk-based approach in order to assure that risks of public health are being addressed in a timely manner. The post-market guidance maps to 5 core functions of the NIST framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity. Those 5 core functions are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So it was important for us in writing our draft guidance that we had developed that crosswalk for each of those core functions, drilling down, becoming more granular as to what that means. How does that translate for medical devices and medical device manufacturers? Now, we can take what's in our draft guidance and boil it down to really to 3 concepts. The most important one, really the key cornerstone here, is the last one. We have to be able to get to a risk assessment of the essential clinical performance of the device. How are we going to do that cybersecurity risk assessment? By really using 2 different axes. Number one, an assessment of the exploitability of the vulnerability. And 2, by assessing the severity of impact to health. This is a oversimplification of a lot of the detail that's in the guidance, but really those are the 3 key concepts that are here. Assessing exploitability, assessing severity, impact to health, and by looking at those 2 axes, how to figure out where that risk is, where that vulnerability really is in the context of affecting or impacting on the performance of that device from a safety and functionality perspective. We can further deconstruct a comprehensive and a cybersecurity risk management program that includes really all of these elements here. And these elements harken back to some of the gaps that were identified that I highlighted in the MITRE stakeholder study. For example, understanding, assessing, and detecting presence and impact of a vulnerability, and having processes that are in place for handling those vulnerabilities, for taking them in, and being able to do the appropriate kind of assessment. adopting a coordinated disclosure policy and practice, and ultimately about deploying the mitigations that will address that risk early and prior to exploitation. So, summing up, what are the key takeaways from this talk this afternoon? There are really two key principles if there's anything that you walk away with. Number one, cybersecurity of medical devices, it's a total product lifecycle approach, from design to obsolescence. And so many of you here who are directly involved in the design and the concept phase, we really FDA looks to you for your direct involvement and participation in this effort. Collaboration is critical. If we're going to foster a whole-of-community approach, we have to be able to build this kind of network of partnerships. How are we going to make this happen? What do we need? For all stakeholders to recognize their role. For us to be able to, in partnership, change this culture of engagement, to enable cyber hygiene to become paramount, to create that trusted environment for information sharing, and for developing tools that are going to serve as further enablers for vulnerability assessment, disclosure, and remediation. I'm providing here two resources. One is our general webpage that's publicly facing on cybersecurity, where there's a lot of information on the work that's ongoing and work that's been previously done, as well as the draft guidance, which is in the public comment period right now. And with that, again, I really want to thank everybody for their attention and for really this opportunity, this privilege to be able to speak to this audience, because so many of you here can have a great impact in moving us in a positive direction, and we look to you for your participation with us on this effort. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions at this time.
We do have time for some questions, and I believe there are mics running around.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for your talk, it's very clear. One question I have is, these initiatives, these platforms to connect and to communicate, would these same platforms be suitable to also discuss not only whether we keep the patient data safe, but also to show our clients and customers that we will use that information responsibly? So more from a privacy perspective. Would that be the same? Could we use the same channels and platforms for that discussion?
You bring up a really important point. As you know, I really did not touch much at all here in this discussion about privacy. And there's a reason for that. FDA authority is really around this security, the safety and effectiveness of the devices, and privacy kind of falls outside of our domain proper. Having said that, that's why it's so important, because these systems and these platforms are very much interconnected, and privacy issues become important issues for patients. That is where we, working together, FDA, with some of our federal partners, whether they are within the Department of HHS or whether they are outside of HHS with other federal government and other private entities, we have to be able to crack this, difficult nut with regard to privacy issues as well.
Thank you very much. Wonderful talk, very timely and important to the industry. Once in a while we hear from our federal government that so many attacks have been avoided on our country or in a certain area, which is very gratifying as citizens. With regard to cyber security of medical devices, can you give us a flavor of, have there been some activities that have actually been reduced already, some threats to various devices?
So, First, let me say that we at FDA are not aware of any near misses or any deliberate or malicious attempts to try to cause harm to patients by deliberately attacking a medical device. That's number one. Whether there have been other efforts, other attempts outside of that that have perhaps not been deliberate towards a medical device or harming a patient, but rather to use a device as a conduit to get to other, to monetize, for example, PII or PHI, or for other purposes. There's published awareness for what we could speak about publicly. There is awareness that there have been such attempts, and some have been successful, which is why it's important that we all take this very, very seriously. One of the things that FDA, as well as all of our other operating divisions within HHS and our government partners do within this space is have direct conversations and briefings from the intelligence community and from other sources to be in a better, again, forward-leaning position as to concerns around any potential for whether, they are malicious attacks or other reasons for wanting to utilize a medical device as a means of criminal means or as a nation-state related means. So that's probably the best way that I can answer that at this stage. It's a wake-up call, though, for all of us. It surely is, and it's one why we all have a part to play here.
Thank you for the talk. Very timely again, and very, very relevant for today's situation. My question is about, aside from cybersecurity, aside from the hospitals protecting patients, shouldn't patients and the public be also accountable for their own protection? For example, motor vehicles are regulated by a safety board and their codes and their safety requirements. But at the same time, citizens are required to buy car insurance. Mm-hmm. Citizens are required not to drive while drunk. Citizens are required to be lawful and stop at a stop sign, stuff like that. There's still a responsibility. And I think the answer to the whole question should not just boil down to medical device manufacturers being very, having the protection, but also public should also protect themselves as well. What do you say about that?
And yes, I hope that I was able to articulate clearly that the focus that we have on whole of community is this concept of shared responsibility and shared ownership. And I would recommend looking at, in fact, the communications that we have put out in the past, which really speak to the responsibilities that the different parts of this ecosystem really do have ownership for. We know that fixing or building the best device, the most secure device in a vacuum, is not going to protect against what happens once it's put on a network that might not be secure, for example. And speaking to this idea also of raising awareness, educating and training in the healthcare system, boots on the ground, those that are the providers, those that are interfacing and interacting with devices, making cyber hygiene paramount, those are all, in some ways, those are low-hanging fruit that really can be dealt with, that really therefore kind of distribute the idea of accountability across, across the universe. As far as patients go, patients do have responsibility. We see this as, and this kind of blends in with CDRH as one of our strategic priorities for 2016 and 2017 is partnering with patients. And I see a very defined role for partnering with patients in medical device security as well. in terms of empowering patients as to what they can be doing, what they should be aware of, how informed are they. It's interesting because there are patients who are security researchers that are very well aware, and they are the ones who are really pushing the envelope in terms of even having those kinds of informed dialogue with their providers. But that's not the norm. That's, a sliver of, obviously, the patient population. We do need to make this more broadly known, and that's why we've been on this campaign of increasing awareness and really trying to convey that there is no one single entity amongst all of us that is wholly, responsible and accountable for everything here. This is very much a shared space.
Last question over here.
Yeah, this is maybe a little bit of a complex question, but most devices are, and just so many different things are now done on a global basis as opposed to a national basis. And the question is the approach that you're taking, is it something that we can only assume would hold in the U.S., or is there a way of harmonizing these kinds of cybersecurity techniques or issues such that, if you fly to Europe, you're not suddenly in a whole different regime where you're not protected anymore?
Great question, and one that we have been dealing with, working on in partnering, first of all, with our regulatory agencies overseas to have these conversations, but also at a higher level, more broadly at HHS, with developing different partnering and information sharing agreements with some of the healthcare agents, the public health agencies in the UK, in Europe, and outside the US, because we do see this as, it's a global issue. It can't be simply a national issue. So to the extent that the guidance that we've already put out, that in discussions that we're having with our partners, our regulatory partners in other parts of the world, we're hoping that that will lead to further kinds of harmonization. Obviously, it is a much more complex picture with regard to how different countries regulate and what kinds of also, cybersecurity regulations they fall under. But those conversations are definitely happening. And clearly we can't approach this as though it's an insular issue within the United States, and that when you go off to another country, you're going to be faced with a whole different set of regulations and other policies and other frameworks to deal with. So a lot that's happening in that area at present.
Thank you.
Thank you.